Democrats are facing an unavoidable consequence. Time is running out for President Biden and his party to change course.
This issue has to be settled this week.
This has to be settled in the next week.
Right.
This can't go on any longer.
How long can Democrats afford to be continuing to have this discussion?
I say just a couple of weeks.
And even some of Biden's top supporters in Congress, like Senator Chris Murphy and Congressman Adam Schiff, are saying Biden needs to make his case to voters now, this week, or else making a tough decision.
And so I think this week is going to be absolutely critical. I think the president needs to do more. But if he can't do that, then he's got a decision to make about what the path forward is.
How quickly does he have to make this decision, though? The next week, the next 10 days?
It needs to be made promptly, but frankly, more important than speed is getting it right.
And behind the scenes, congressional Democrats are even more blunt on Biden's prospects. One Democratic lawmaker who previously endorsed President Biden told NBC News they will be breaking their silence on his political future, quote, soon. Another House Democrat predicted there will be more calls for Biden to step aside in the coming days, and that is coming from House Democrats who remain anonymous with their dissent. However, NBC News can now confirm that 4 top House Democrats, Joe Morell, Jerry Nadler, Adam Smith, and Mark Takano, have now joined the ongoing list of congressional Democrats calling for Biden to step aside. And that brings the total number to 9 House Democrats. These new calls came during a virtual meeting this afternoon with House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries to discuss Biden's path forward. Meanwhile, Biden remains defiant on staying in the race, telling ABC's George Stephanopoulos that it would only take, quote, the Lord Almighty to get him to drop out of the race. We're only 120 days till the presidential election. At the end of the day, the decision will come down to you, the voter. And regardless of what happens with President Biden or the Democrats, another clear question remains. Are they listening to the people who elect them? Here's what President Biden said when asked about his poor poll numbers.
You're behind now in the popular vote.
I don't buy that.
Is it worth the risk?
I don't think anybody's more qualified to be president or win this race than me.
I don't buy the polls. No one is more qualified than me. It might sound familiar. It's clear from that answer that Joe Biden isn't listening to the people who helped him defeat Donald Trump. And one of my next guests writes in the Washington Post that enough is enough. Adam Frisch, Democratic congressional candidate for Colorado's 3rd District, says it is time for President Biden to step aside, saying, quote, he should put personal ambition aside and then stand up and announce he will withdraw from consideration. The deep Democratic bench should work to nominate a younger slate. Adam Frisch is with us now, as well as Tara Setmeyer, co-founder and CEO of the Seneca Project, and David Korn, MSNBC political analyst and Washington bureau chief at Mother Jones. Great to have all 3 of you with us. Adam, I'll start with you. Give us the argument. Talk to us about why you believe President Biden should step aside, given his track record, given the fact that he has beaten President Trump previously, and given the fact that he has delivered in his first 3.5 years what the American people set him out to do.
Listen, great to see everyone, and happy July 4th on Sunday. You know, I'll leave the political analysis to some others, but I can say blatantly that 27 polls can't be wrong. I thought they might have had the ability to change over the next couple months, but obviously I think we've just run out of time. I'm talking to steel workers down in Pueblo and farmers in Mesa County and ranchers elsewhere in Southwest Colorado. And these are boots on the ground, $10 donors, people that aren't really involved in politics. And they just see what a lot of people see, except for the inner circle of the president, which is that he can't win. And you don't govern if you don't win. I've learned that much.
Why do they think he cannot win? What do they tell you, these people that you're speaking to that are not interested in politics or are not engaged in politics, but also you're saying they can see that he cannot win? What are they basing that on, and why do they believe he cannot win?
Well, I mean, I think all of them watched the debate or they saw clips of the debate. Some of them saw the ABC News interview or snippets of it. His last line was one of the most damaging, I think, that he seemed to be kind of nonplussed if all of a sudden he loses, but as long as they gave it the old college try, that's not much of a problem. And the argument that he and so many people are making about how important this presidential race is, doesn't seem to square with what the president is saying. And I think that you don't have to be a political animal to kind of get the vibe of what's going around. And, it's just going in the wrong direction. And 4 years ago was a different story, was a different person, was a different health conversation as well.
Tara, give me your thoughts on the debate that's raging on right now, whether President Biden should step aside. And we can talk about the growing call of Democrats, some prominent names, including Jerry Nadler, a longtime a longtime Biden ally, saying that he should drop out. But walk me through the counter argument to that, why he needs to stay in the race, and if whether or not, as he said, he is the most qualified person to beat Trump.
Well, I would ask all of these people, are they prepared to ask President Biden, who's had an extremely successful first term with legislative accomplishments that we haven't seen in recent history for a first-term president, with an economy that's actually booming in this country, with unprecedented job growth, low unemployment, number one energy producer in the world, stock market through the roof. Are they prepared to ask him to step down? Because that's ultimately what these people are asking President Biden to do, is to step down from the presidency. Because he can't step aside and say, well, I don't have it together enough to go on as the candidate, but I can still remain president of the United States. There's no way that's going to happen. So we need to have an honest conversation with what they're asking. I think that at this point, that it's really up to President Biden. It's up to him what he decides to do. But the piling on, particularly in the media and the punditry class for the last 10 days has not been helpful. You can ask those questions, sure. And you know what? President Biden has to prove himself. Absolutely. That was a disastrous debate. Everybody acknowledges that. He is on the world stage next week, and he will have to prove himself again. However, he has not demonstrated thus far that he's incapable of running the country. Are we in a crisis? Are a million people dying? Do we have, portable morgues in the streets of New York City and mass graves like we did 4 years ago? Is the country in disarray? It is not. So I am just concerned about the way that this is now being reported on. Enough. Everybody gets it. He needs to prove himself. But in the meantime, we are losing focus on what's actually happening on the other side. There is more news than just that Joe Biden is old. And I think Democrats need to also recognize the impracticality of what they're asking to do. This is not an Aaron Sorkin West Wing episode. It doesn't work that way, where President Biden just gets to walk away and they get to write in a new candidate. There are a lot of issues, and Democrats, no offense to my Democratic friends, but they're like herding cats. They can't agree on what time of day it is most of the time. And there were 700 uncommitted delegates for the DNC before this. They still weren't unified, even with President Biden winning overwhelmingly in the primary. So they think we're going to go into a brokered convention in August and everyone's going to come out smelling like roses and they're going to be unified? That is unlikely and impractical. And that's not even talking about ballot access in all 50 states, which is a problem too. So this is something I think that needs to be a balanced conversation. And they need to know that President Biden's already proven himself to beat Donald Trump. It's not an unknown moving forward. With him, if you bring in another candidate, they have to be vetted. They always have skeletons in their closet, too. And we are only 120 days away from the election. Stay focused, eye on the prize, and know that the enemy here is MAGA, Donald Trump, and that extremism and the end of our democracy, not Joe Biden.
All right, David, last but certainly not least, I want to bring you into the conversation for your opinion on this and where you come down. Tara has said the phrase, he needs to prove himself a few times. He has proven himself as president, but you did say he needs to prove himself a few more times. But I do want to know what you think in terms of the window as to how long this conversation can drag out for before there is a unity among the party behind the candidate. Is time of the essence here, or can they afford to drag this out to the convention through the next several weeks?
Certainly not that long. To me, the issue is what happened at the debate. Was it an episode or a condition? And I just look at the odds here. If Biden can get through the next few weeks and up to the election without having a repeat of that in any sort of way, and prove that this is not a debilitating condition, the Democrats are kind of where they were at the beginning of this crisis or controversy. But so far since the debate, I would, give him a B- B maybe on doing what he needs to do to demonstrate that was just a one-off. He's still, the speeches he gave were forceful, but he still hasn't had a lot of sort of unscheduled time with voters and reporters when you can really see him at work. I mean, he had a good day today campaigning. MSNBC has shown the clips. They're all over social media. But I still think that his campaign hasn't forcefully enough put him out there to deal with the concerns, the real concerns.
What would it take, David? I mean, specifically, give me some specifics as to what it would take to assuage those concerns. What are you talking about here, specifically about what you think needs to be done besides these scripted events with small groups of people? What do you want to see?
Well, I want to see him engage with other people in an unscripted moment. It could be voters, it could be reporters. It doesn't have, but in a town hall meeting, perhaps, would be a good way to do this, right? Talk to voters, take questions. Some might be difficult questions, so that you can really see him. And I was surprised that the campaign, we talk about time here, has wasted time. They didn't do this immediately after the debate. He did a good speech about the Supreme Court decision making the president essentially a king, but they need to take questions afterwards. And it doesn't have to be with the media. I'm not saying that, but a town hall or something like that. And I think they need to do it soon because we're getting close to a dam breaking, and if that happens, terror, we're going to have this chaotic scenario out there with people, the Democratic Party split in half, essentially, which will not lead to easy decision-making about what comes next if something else has to come next.
Adam, your thoughts on Tara's argument, and more importantly, do you believe that Joe Biden on the ticket hurts down-ballot races in swing states and other competitive races throughout this country?
Well, with respect to the other panelists on here, I just want to push back against the punditry class. I've driven 57,000 miles in the past 2.5 years. I'm home 5 days a month for the past 2 years, and I'm talking to independents and Democrats and Republicans, and everyone's frustrated. I was one of the people of which 75% of the people did not want this rematch. I asked for 2 years ago to have an open primary. It's one thing for us to say that there's a cult leader going on there, but one party, with all due respect, actually had an open primary, and one party decided to shut it down. And so I just think that, ideally the time has sailed for a lot of different things, but we have to figure out what is the best way to build an anti-Trump coalition. And it's not a pro-Biden coalition. And those are two different things. I'm just going to go back to what I'm hearing on the ground, again, from farmers and ranchers. They're frustrated with both parties' candidates. They would love to see a new generation. The Democratic Party has a great new diverse generation, and it's not too late to get something done. It's not ideal, but it's not late. And I think we need to focus on that as opposed to believing that it's just a bunch of DC talking heads that are actually calling for this. I'm telling you, I guarantee you I've spoken to more people than probably everyone you've had on the television for the past 3 or 4 days, if not the past 3 or 4 weeks, getting out there to the rural parts of the country, listening to real people.
No, and certainly that's a valid point. That's a valid point. You are a candidate after all, so we certainly hope that you are doing that. But go ahead, Tara. You wanted to jump in and make a point as well.
Just a couple of things.
Sure.
It's not news that the American people are frustrated with the two choices. That's not news. But those are the choices. And if there was to be an open primary, we can't wish cast what should have been before. What happened is Joe Biden won the Democratic primary, and we are in July. In 2008, Barack Obama only had 50% in the Democratic Party support when he was on his way to winning the nomination. 50% at this point in 2008. And guess what? He won over 90% of the Democratic votes. So understanding that people are frustrated now, I hear you. Is it an ideal situation? It's not. But it's a binary choice right now. And you cannot, if you were to ask those same people, if they understood what it took in order to switch out President Biden now? Are they prepared? Do they want President Biden to resign the presidency? I would like to see what people think about that. Do they think that?
Why is that the issue? Sorry, I just don't understand. Why are you asking people to resign? Nobody's saying he should resign. People are worried that he's not going to be able to finish 4 more years. And if
politically, you can't keep him as president and expect him to step down away from the nomination. There will be too much pressure on him to have to step completely away and let Kamala Harris ascend to the vice presidency so she can demonstrate to people that she's running.
David,
this is just that's the political reality of that.
Go ahead, David.
Tara, I think you make a really good point about the dynamics of what would happen if you switch someone out. Running a presidential campaign is really one of the hardest things to do, and campaigning for president ditto. And so very few people do this well. A lot of people try, most fail. Putting somebody new in, Adam, who's young and fresh and dynamic, at this stage of the game, I don't think is practical. I think the only practical alternative to Joe Biden would be Kamala Harris. Right. I don't think Biden has to resign the presidency. He can say, I worry about what I would be like in another year or two. I see, I see myself slowing down. And I think you could, hand it over to Kamala. She could inherit part of the organization. But having a new cast of characters, Adam, at this stage of the game, who will come in, they will fight each other. The convention will be chaotic, maybe chaotic on the outside. I think it's too late for that. I think you're down to.
They can't transfer the money, David. You know that. They can't transfer the money.
Really quickly, Adam, do you think it should be Kamala Harris if Joe Biden does take the decision to step down? Would you be happy with? Do you get a sense from voters that you've been speaking to that Kamala Harris would be a better replacement or one that people could get behind and certainly address the issue of age? That is not a factor with her. She's certainly competent. She has the experience. She's been in competitive campaigns. She knows the White House. She knows the organizational infrastructure. She does check all of those boxes and concerns that David and Tara are raising.
Listen, I don't think it's too late. France and England can run races. It might be helpful that actually there's a pushback against the political industrial complex to actually run a four-month campaign, right, for the country. And not everyone, there are names out there that have been floating around. We can figure out how to do this. There's a way to set up town halls that should have happened ideally a long time ago, but it's not too late to do it. And, listen, I think if you want to really build a coalition, with all due respect, you grab a salt shaker, paint it blue, it gets 47% of the vote. Somebody has to figure out how to get the couple extra percent to win. This is not about starting from ground zero. There's enough funds out there to be able to run the race that needs to get raced. I'm just telling you, people are sick and tired of these two candidates, and I think it can be liberating for someone to actually stand up and make a stand, and that's what I and other people have been trying to do. And we'll see how it goes out. Now, whether the vice president wants to put her name in the hat, I assumed that she would, and I fully support that. I also fully support those 5 or 10 names that everyone spends time talking about, and I think there's still a way through some town halls and some debates and candidate forums to figure out some type of assortment as you run into the convention, which is in some time in a month or something like that. I think it can be done.
How do you raise the money? Adam, how do you raise the money? If it's not Kamala Harris and it's some new slate of candidates, they have to start from zero, from scratch. The money doesn't transfer over. The war chest does not because of campaign finance laws. And what about ballot access? What do you do about that with the deadlines for ballot access? It costs billions of dollars to run for president. You think that's going to happen in 4 months? You can't compare us to Europe. We're a completely different system. This is a fantasy. And I think it's a disservice to tell the American people that it's practical for us to just switch out a president of the United States and just start a whole new campaign 4 months before the election when he's actually done a pretty damn good job. And at this point, until he demonstrates that he is incompetent of running the country, then I think that only he can make that decision moving forward. And we need to start putting the focus back on Donald Trump and what he's doing and not let them get away with it. Women's rights are on the line. Our democracy is on the line. And we cannot keep doing this. We're handing this over to MAGA.
All right, guys.
I mean, it's clear.
Sorry, guys. I know. We can keep having this conversation for such a long time. It is an important conversation. I promise you we're going to try to continue this conversation as much as we can. I certainly appreciate the three of you joining me tonight with all of your insights. Also, some breaking news that we got while we were on the air, that scheduled call tomorrow with Senate Democrats by Senator Mark Warner, that is not taking place tomorrow. We don't know when it will take place, but it is a sign that scheduled call will not be taking place. Tara Setmeyer, David Corn, Adam Frisch, thank you to the three of you for starting us off tonight. Thank you so much.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.